An empty bed. A door left slightly ajar. A man simply ceased to exist. In the shadows of Boston, 50 sailors vanished without a trace. No struggle, no screams, just a chilling silence. While the Crown points to a lie, something was hunting in the night, and it wasn't looking for gold. The records are gone, the witnesses silenced, but the truth is about to surface. The autumn of 1772. A heavy and humid fog had settled over Boston, the busiest port in British North America. This weather was not merely a meteorological event, it was also the physical manifestation of the intense political tension gripping the city. Boston, though a center of trade and wealth during this period, was virtually suffocating under the pressure of royal troops. Political tension was felt in every corner of the harbor. The rage of the populace resembled the low growl of a coming storm. The city's mood was tense. Popular harbor establishments like George's Tavern and other coffee houses were filled not only with the smell of tobacco and rum, but also with whispers of liberty and growing murmurs against British authority. At the time, every edict arriving from across the ocean further eroded the public's belief in freedom. The wet and dark docks of the harbor were becoming the stage for a dehumanizing operation in the shadow of this great political conflict. Merchant ships, while carrying wealth, housed seamen in their lower decks who carried the fuse of the future rebellion. Firstly, this operation was not a simple case of theft or an isolated murder. The Royal Navy frequently used press gangs, that is, forced recruitment gangs, to fill their ships. These gangs moved around the harbor under the night fog and darkness, finding their victims, cornering them in narrow streets, and then transporting them unconscious to waiting warships. This entire action was carried out with a silent, cold-blooded, and professional speed without creating loud noise or conflict. Care was taken not to leave a trace. The actions of the press gangs were primarily aimed at finding sailors. Some commentators suggested that this might indirectly affect the American resistance, but there is no historical evidence that this was a conscious strategy. This situation turned the docks from a crime scene into an ominous stage where an invisible hand hunted. This series of disappearances went down in history not as a single major crime, but as a chain of systematic, silent losses. Although some sources related to the losses suggest the names of specific sailors, the accuracy of these names has not been definitively proven. However, the commonality among these individuals was the fact that they were ordinary, poor but skilled sailors and dock workers, most needed by the port city. These seamen were indispensable to the merchant fleets and accustomed to the hardships of the high seas. Although they were recorded in official records as deserters, their families and friends knew they would never have left voluntarily. This official label was seen as an authoritarian attempt to obscure the nature of the event. The detection of the disappearances began not with a single moment of shock, but with the frightening accumulation of missing person reports. The matter became official in the autumn of 1772 when the list of missing sailors, compiled under pressure from local militia and harbor merchants, was submitted to the royal authorities. This list showed that more than 50 seamen had suddenly disappeared in just a few months. The common thread in the missing person reports was this: these individuals had paid their debts, left their belongings, and made agreements for their next voyages. So they had no valid reason to flee. Some had not even collected their last wages. Contrary to the official records forming the basis of the investigation, this situation clearly indicated coercion and external intervention behind the event. The fact that the losses occurred at different points around the harbor, usually between midnight and dawn, proved the size and organization of the operation.
As the number of missing person reports increased, an atmosphere of distrust began to prevail in the harbor coffeehouses.
The first to feel this chain of disappearances were the helpless relatives left behind. The fiancée of the young sailor William Tucker, Sarah, was among the first to notice his departure after a routine dinner at home that evening, saying he would be back in an hour, and his subsequent failure to return. The shock Sarah experienced was different from that of a sudden death. This was a void where their loved ones were dragged away to an unknown fate without leaving a trace. All that remained was a cold bed and the silhouette of royal ships visible from the window. However, the real fear the public felt was not the disappearance itself, but the attitude taken by the royal authority towards these losses. Local officials were issuing official statements claiming the missing had fled voluntarily or joined other ships as stowaways. This official stance compounded the shock felt by the person who first reported the incident, a neighbor or spouse. In fact, they were experiencing not only a loss, but also the despair of seeing a truth denied by the authorities. The public knew the answer to the question, whose ship are the missing on, was the British warships right in front of the harbor. This situation led to a deep erosion of trust in the justice system and the British administration within Boston society. How could people trust an authority that could not even protect their own children and husbands? These disappearances, beyond an ordinary crime, were a cold testament to the fact that the public's freedom and personal safety could be seized at any moment by an arbitrary power. This event created immense emotional pressure for every family living in pre-revolutionary Boston, forcing them to live with the reality that an invisible hand had taken away their dearest ones. The cries of the missing rising from Boston Harbor fell silent when they met a wall that was the law itself. This tragedy was not an ordinary murder case. The mechanism behind it was one of the Crown's most stringent and cruel laws. This is why the disappearance of hundreds of sailors without a trace led to the fact that a real investigation could never be launched. The fundamental reason behind these losses was a legitimate yet morally questionable tool in the Crown's hands, the Impressment Act. This law authorized the Navy to recruit soldiers. Thus, the actions of the press gangs were technically not illegal. However, the manner in which this law was applied transformed the law into an arbitrary weapon. At the time, the initiation of the investigation was distorted from the very beginning by the royalist officials in Boston. The missing person reports, hopefully submitted by families, were not entered into police records as missing person, but directly as deserter or fleeing sailor. This official label terminated the entire legal process before it could even begin. Primarily, the situation turned the efforts of local militia or civil activists to find the truth directly into a military authority conflict. The pursuit of civil justice clashed with the unshakable authority of the British Navy and was turned back. This was the way the chronology was distorted. The disappearances were politically closed off, not at the moment they occurred, but at the moment they were recorded. The case of the missing sailor in October 1772 is the most obvious example of this systematic cover-up. The missing sailor's wife presented officials with a letter proving her husband had no debt and had even been promised work for the next day by a merchant at the harbor. Yet, despite all the evidence, the Royal Investigation Office closed the file with a desertion ruling in just 3 days. The law prioritized the needs of the Navy over individual evidence and legal procedure. This caused the people of Boston to realize that the Crown's laws existed only for its own interests. When we look at the evidence we have, unfortunately, there were no physical clues such as autopsy reports, fingerprints, or laboratory analysis. Eyewitness testimonies were the only source of evidence needed for the investigation to progress in Boston at that time. These statements were usually relayed in whispers by harbor workers who concealed their identities, fearing they would reach the ears of British spies. The testimonies included individual case examples regarding the moments of disappearances. A sailor dragged out the back door of a tavern.
a figure forcibly put into a boat on the dock before dawn. For example, Abigail Jones, a harbor merchant, had seen press gangs forcibly take 3 sailors one night. However, when she tried to testify, she was directly threatened by royal soldiers. Abigail Jones's testimony was never officially recorded by the police due to military pressure. This situation showed that fear had become a stronger form of evidence than eyewitness testimonies in Boston.
But these emotional and scattered testimonies did not have the power to advance the investigation, because apart from the technological deficiencies of the time, the real obstacle was political. The small number of honest local militias conducting the investigation had no authority to approach the royal ships. It was impossible to inquire about the fate of a sailor forcibly taken onto a ship. This was equivalent to officially going onto a British warship and asking, "Are you gathering your fighting force with fugitives?" This situation was tantamount to a direct attempt at rebellion. This despair drove the investigation itself into a dead end. Some honest local officials would even note in their ledgers, "Finding a sailor is harder than finding a needle between the muzzles of the warships in our harbor." This was the sharpest reflection of the political, not technological, despair in the quest for justice. What the investigation could not find a physical trace of was the final destination of the missing sailors. The living conditions of these forcibly enlisted sailors on the ships revealed the emotional pressure they endured and the total stripping away of their free will. These individuals were forced into grueling duties lasting months, even years. Physical violence might not have been applied, but they became the property of the crown. Thus, their freedoms were completely taken away. Families were living with the emotional burden created by the legal rejection from official authorities, despite knowing which ship their loved ones were on. The tears of the wives and children of the missing were met with an icy wall in the courtrooms and royal offices. This situation intensified the deep moral dilemma and frustration experienced by local activists and militias who knew the truth but were bound by political pressure. They were caught between the legal process and political necessity. The Impressment Act did not just cause the loss of sailors from Boston, it also caused the public to lose the last fragments of faith they had in the British justice system. This chronology is less a detective story and more a record of systematic oppression applied by a government to its own citizens.
As we mentioned before, the systematic cover-up had turned the disappearance of the sailors from a simple crime into a legal war. However, this legal oppression did not remain silent in Boston. It rapidly turned into a mass hysteria spreading through the city streets. The stories of the missing individuals quickly became a common nightmare for every family. No one felt safe anymore. The fear of the door being knocked on permeated everything from dinner table conversations to harbor coffee houses. This situation further fueled the anti-British wave of anger. The people of Boston realized they were not just losing individuals, but that their freedom and security were being taken away by a royal edict. When night fell and the harbor lights were lit, mothers and wives started bolting their doors from the inside. Every stranger walking in the narrow streets of Boston, especially every large shadowed figure not wearing a British military uniform, was perceived as a potential press gang member. The tension experienced by the public was so high that even the slightest argument in harbor bars was mistaken for a press gang raid, causing great panic. Townspeople had started setting up voluntary night patrols to protect their neighbors. These patrols frequently engaged in verbal altercations and occasionally physical scuffles when they encountered British patrols. This tension experienced by the public found its most concrete expression through the press. Pro-revolutionary newspapers, especially the Boston Gazette and Massachusetts Spy, used these disappearances not just as news, but as a political manifesto. These disappearances were presented in their headlines as new evidence of royal tyranny. That is, they were made the clearest proof of the injustice applied by the British administration to its own citizens. These publications channeled the public's anger and transformed chaotic fear into a desire for organized resistance. While this public outrage continued, the pursuit of justice on the legal front was systematically obstructed. Local militias and publicly supported lawyers attempted to open missing person cases in local courts. However, all these attempts were constantly blocked by the British Admiralty Courts. These courts had jurisdiction over all maritime matters. Naturally, they protected the Crown's interests. But the court's argument was simple and definitive. The missing are deserters, and this is the internal affair of the Navy, not of the civil courts. This situation created a conflict of jurisdiction in the legal process, using the excuse of insufficient evidence as a shield. Even when civil lawyers brought eyewitnesses who could prove the forced recruitment to court, the Admiralty Courts rejected these testimonies as rebellious statements or hearsay town gossip. Behind this series of disappearances were not only anonymous press gang members, but also a political and commercial structure supporting them. For example, some local merchants and customs officers in the harbor were accused of leaking lists of ships favored by the Navy. Thus, the organizational structure of the crime extended to Boston's political and commercial elite. The presence of these collaborators reinforced the perception that the event was not just a military action, but also an act of treason within the colony.
These legal obstacles and social tension created a sharp contrast between the courtroom and the street. Every lawsuit filed to advance the investigation was turning into a theater stage. During the hearings, the cold and indifferent attitudes of the Crown-appointed judges ignored the despair of the missing sailors' wives. The judges' decision seemed to be driven by a concern to re-establish the authority of the Crown rather than legal arguments. The atmosphere outside the courtroom, however, was completely different. As court decisions were awaited, hundreds of Bostonians surrounded the courthouse, and every rejection decision triggered a massive wave of protest. Small-scale but constantly increasing clashes occurred between British soldiers and dock workers in the streets. In late 1772, following the rejection of the case filed by the family of a forcibly enlisted sailor, the angry crowd marched on a British customs house in that area and damaged the building. These events served as a court not only for the missing sailors, but also for the political future of the colony. That is, the public was playing its last card against the administration through these disappearances. The social turmoil in Boston had reached the brink of a silent rebellion. This situation was creating deep frustration for those seeking justice and chasing the truth. They knew the Crown was deliberately obscuring the truth. This frustration was evaluated by some historians and commentators as having possibly contributed indirectly to the growing social anger and resistance against the American Revolution. These tragedies in Boston Harbor were not just an unsolved mystery, but also a bitter case where justice was defeated by political power. The fate of the missing sailors was sealed as a permanent uncertainty behind the protective shield of courtrooms and military power.
The biggest obstacle to closing the case was not merely insufficient evidence, but a permanent systemic alliance of legal and political barriers. Firstly, the Admiralty Courts attached to the Navy cited the excuse of the inaccessibility and secrecy of the ship records where the forcibly enlisted were kept. This situation made it completely impossible to access the personnel lists, which were the only concrete data that could theoretically prove the existence of sailors on Navy ships. This obstruction meant the law was intentionally blinded.
Those seeking justice were given nothing but a fog curtain with a lantern held in the darkness. The Crown's thesis that the missing sailors were deserters should have been refuted in light of the geopolitical and economic necessities of the time, rather than being a simple official lie. The year 1772 was a period when Britain was trying to tighten military control over the colonies and was also in constant rivalry with the French at sea. The Navy's personnel shortage was chronic. These forced enlistment operations were an illegal way to sustain war capability. For instance, while the expert sailor William Tucker was claimed to have deserted, the Navy's records clearly indicated the urgent need for skilled sailors like him. This situation clearly demonstrates that the Crown deliberately ignored these actions and consequently allowed no investigation to succeed. Of course, from a modern forensic science perspective, this case would cease to be an unsolvable mystery today. Nowadays, even the slightest biological trace, historical DNA residue left behind during scuffles and forced recruitment could reveal the identity of the missing sailors. Or, with modern profiling techniques, the operations of the press gangs could be analyzed as a systematic criminal network, revealing the financial and command chain behind these gangs.
However, the lack of these techniques at the time, and most importantly, the complete absence of political will for the pursuit of justice, made the resolution of the case historically impossible. This mystery lies not in the dusty shelves of history, but in the corruption of the system. Over time, this insolubility became a symbol of the permanent hatred felt by the Boston public towards the Crown. The harbor, even years after these losses, continued to carry the shadow of unseen danger. The key point that led to the full legal closure of the case in the public eye was a controversial and manipulative document. Royal officials produced a short note resembling the handwriting of one of the missing sailors to the effect of, "I will try my luck on another ship," claiming it was proof of voluntary desertion. The presentation of this note by the Crown as a final dramatic move legally suppressed the objections of the public and local officials. However, the ink of the note, the type of paper, and the clichés in its language were quickly questioned by skeptical observers. This note pointed to strong suspicions that it had been written under duress and coercion on the ships where the press gangs forcibly held their victims. The presentation of this fake evidence destroyed the last glimmer of hope for those seeking justice. It proved that the Crown manipulated this incident to the very end to ensure silence. This situation reinforced the feeling that the veil of mystery never lifted and that the truth was sacrificed for political expediency.
This insolubility deeply affected those who sought the truth. The small number of local activists and journalists who led the investigation dedicated a large part of their lives to uncovering the truth about this case. However, they experienced deep disappointment and ethical collapse over the impossibility of the official closure of the case. On the other hand, the relatives of the victims had to live with unofficial information that their loved ones had suffered and died on the ships. For them, this was neither a prison sentence nor a missing person declaration. This meant perpetual uncertainty. The fates of the missing sailors remained in the shadow of the great narrative of history's revolution. There are also comments suggesting that the fear and anger created by these losses indirectly influenced the political discourse of the era. These stories circulating among the public might have contributed to the growth of the reaction against the royal administration. However, their individual justice was never served. This insolubility showed that the fog that settled over Boston Harbor was actually the permanent shadow of a systemic betrayal and impunity. These disappearances could not be solved as crime cases, but their impact changed the course of history.
Every missing sailor became the final nail hammered into the coffin of trust in Britain's justice system. This series of events concretely proved to the local population that the Crown's authority was arbitrary and dangerous. The public had seen that beyond taxes, their personal safety was under threat. Firstly, this situation created a very strong source of motivation for the path leading to major actions such as the Boston Tea Party. Now, protests were being carried out not just for economic rights, but also for the basic right to survival. These actions by the Crown under the name of impressment were the sharpest definition of tyranny for the colonies.
The legal legacy of this tragedy lies at the heart of the American identity even today. The Impressment Act served as a counterexample in the formation of the United States Constitution. The founders strove to ensure that such arbitrary military power could never be used again. Fundamental values such as liberty, personal safety, and property rights emphasized in the constitutions were defined as a response to the victimization by authority experienced by those who disappeared in Boston. That is, these losses had become a monument to the fundamental rights of a new nation. The pain and feeling of insolubility created by these losses are not unique to 18th century Boston. We see the shadow of these losses reappear whenever state violence becomes anonymous in different parts of the world. For instance, 100 years later, thousands of migrant workers silently disappearing due to workplace accidents, overlooked in railway constructions, or mines during the Industrial Revolution. Or today, activists and journalists disappearing without a trace in geographies experiencing political conflicts. The stories of these individuals, just like the Boston sailors, are victims who were ground down and anonymized by the wheels of the system. This situation shows us this. Tyranny works not only through laws, but also through silence and invisibility. Worse than that, if a system can eliminate an individual without a trace, that system has no right to claim justice. These events left the sailors in the dark shadow of history. They can be seen as the first forgotten losses of the Revolution, having generated the first major public reaction against the Crown. But, unfortunately, they are not as well known as the 5 victims of the Boston Massacre, or the activists of the Tea Party. Why? Because their end came not in a visible conflict, but within the cold and silent gears of the system. Disappearing in the hold of an unnamed ship, they paid the most tragic and invisible price for the struggle for freedom. Concluding the story, we can imagine the current state of Boston Harbor. Perhaps it is evening. The harbor is illuminated with modern lights and there is no fog. But this silence raises the question of whether it carries the screams of that era. The fear of those days may have given way to peace. However, that peace is built upon the lost price of the hundreds of nameless sailors who fell into the hands of the press gangs that night. History books usually write about victories and heroes. But the true cost of a revolution rests on the shoulders of people whose names were erased from the records, simply dismissed as deserted. No matter how much political victories try to obscure individual tragedies, the moral burden of these losses is permanent. This story burdens us with the responsibility of questioning not just governments, but history itself. These events whisper to us, sometimes the most important turning points in history do not begin with the biggest wars or the most glorious treaties, but conversely with individual tragedies silently swallowed by the system.